Korea, 1948. Korea is no stranger to war. There have been conflicts in this country since the beginning of recorded history. It seems a bizarre fate for this peaceful country, whose people have always lived in strong family groups, to be affected so constantly by war. A country rich in tradition and culture that has become entangled in other countries' wars because of its location. Korea is a peninsula joining Russia and China. It juts into the sea towards Japan. When this film was shot, Korea was under Japanese rule. The Japanese took control of the whole of Korea in 1910. In 1948, you could travel by boat or air from Japan to Busan, and from Busan through Korea's rich farmland by train all the way to China. Korea developed industries while under Japanese rule in the first half of the 20th century. Its culture shows influences from the Western world beside its own architecture from past centuries. In 1945, when Japan was defeated in the Second World War, Korea was split in two. The United States occupied the southern half and Soviet forces the north.
General and Mrs. Douglas MacArthur are welcomed by General Hodge, United States Commander in Korea. In the American zone, a Korean government has been set up, and Syngman Rhee, President of the new Republic of Korea, comes to pay his respects to the Supreme Commander and Mrs. MacArthur. This is the social aspect of a far-reaching political event in the affairs of the Far East. Headquarters of the new government, which was created according to treaty and after an election ordered by the United States, an election boycotted by Soviet Russia.
In July 1948, Syngman Rhee was elected president of the southern half, the Republic of Korea. America's General MacArthur went to congratulate him on his success. This infuriated the North Koreans, who had refused to participate in the elections. Trouble brewed for 2 years and climaxed in June 1950. On the 25th of June, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel to launch an offensive against the Republic of Korea. President Truman requested an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, and the Council resolved to demand an immediate ceasefire. This was ignored by the North Koreans, leaving the UN no choice but to support the United States in aiding the South Koreans.
While at Tokyo, for the first time in history, the United Nations flag is received to fly in sanctioned battle. General MacArthur accepting the banner from General Collins, U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Evidence branding the communists as the aggressors. At an undisclosed port in South Korea, reinforcements arrived to strengthen the thin line of U.S. forces facing the overwhelming might of the Russian-controlled North Korean communists. A mere trickle as yet, but their delaying battles will make possible further aid. Commanding General Walker and General Dean of the 24th Division confer on the perilous situation. With the troops comes some supporting mechanized equipment. Not enough as yet to give us equality with the foe, who long prepared to have all sorts of heavy Russian armament to throw against us. A bombed airfield is repaired in ancient style by Korean natives. Again, we see our proud B-29s on the line for sorties. Bomb bays loaded, they're ready for their first mission against the new menace. Department of Defense pictures of the first bombing mission against a communist objective. Winged giants of deadly efficiency. Bombs away. And the blockbusters rain through the protective overcast to wipe out the communist installations below. This was a surprise attack that caught the Reds completely off guard. These are the boys who have won the world's gratitude for their gallant delaying actions. A a United Nations delegation questions prisoners and witnesses our GI's heroism. And they can report General MacArthur has had the time he needed, given by this small force, recalling Churchill's words about the few to whom so many owed so much. And speaking of the famed war leader, here he is at Plymouth, England, with this to say about our GIs in Korea.
I do not say that what has happened, and is happening in Korea, has made the dangers of a third world war greater. They were already grave, but it has brought them nearer. I have not the knowledge to enable me to predict how this Korean fighting will end. But let me here express our admiration for the daring and skill with which a handful of American soldiers, 3 or 4 battalions at most, who have as yet been brought into action in Korea, have fought their delaying action against overwhelming odds.
In the first days of the war, the North Koreans, under the command of Kim Il-sung, took advantage of their surprise attack and advanced quickly. The North Korean forces were well equipped with large quantities of tanks, artillery, and infantry weapons supplied by the Soviet Union. The US kept the Australian government informed on the developing crisis in Korea.
Prime Minister Robert Menzies of Australia tells President Truman and Secretary of State Acheson the island continent will send ground troops to Korea, again allied against the forces of tyranny.
Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies was on his way to the US for trade talks when the war in Korea broke out. He took action immediately.
We, as you know, in Australia are not rich in manpower. We feel that our people, when they go to war, are first-class fighters. But in my talks with your leaders here, it's been completely agreed that the time factor is so important in Korea that a comparatively small force, speedily prepared and dispatched, is better than a larger force postponed for many months. And in the light of those considerations, and after full consultation, and I think I may say agreement, with the United States authorities, the Australian government will, on the basis of the army component of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, and further recruitment of men with battle experience, organize and dispatch within as few weeks as possible a force which, cooperating as I hope and believe it will with New Zealand forces, would serve to make up a first-class combat group. All I want to do is to express to you my own faith and the faith of my own country, that we all have laid on us today a duty to be prepared, to be strong.
On his return to Australia, Menzies gave the first in a series of speeches.
I have no doubt myself that the communist tactics are to disperse forces and to divide, to create one incident after another, hoping by those means to denude the democracies of the appropriate power in the vital places. It's a very, very grave problem. Australia will be once more, as in the last Great War, fighting side by side with the American troops, the American sailors, with the American airmen.
The Australian government launched a recruitment campaign. Response was strong, but it was decided to limit the recruitment to those who already had Second World War experience. On the 29th of June, the Australian government committed the Royal Australian Navy ships HMAS Shoalhaven and Bataan and on the 30th of June, 77 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. These units were stationed in Japan as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force. Their duties included the disposal of armaments, repatriation, demobilization of Japanese forces, protection of Allied installations, and the control of smuggling and illegal immigration. Australia had reduced its forces substantially in the years following the Second World War. Those who had been sent back to Australia became the first units of the new Australian Regular Army. HMAS Warramunga, an Australian destroyer, was ordered to sail on the 6th of August. The Warramunga arrived in Busan on the 29th of August to replace HMAS Shoalhaven, which had been at the end of its planned tour when the news of the war was announced. However, it was 77 Squadron that was the first to see combat. 77 Squadron was stationed at Iwakuni, Japan. This base was one of 4 runways suitable for heavily laden jets. 77 Squadron relied on Japanese technicians for maintenance. These technicians, highly trained in the aircraft industry during the Pacific War, were employed as cleaners during the occupation of Japan. They were glad to return to aircraft maintenance. They worked long hours, and they would eagerly await the return of the Australian pilots.
Commanding officer of 77 Squadron is quiet, efficient Wing Commander Lou Spence, DFC. Each morning he says so long to his wife and children, and like millions of civilians, leaves for the office, which happens to be the Korean front line. When he says he's had a hard day at the office, his wife believes him. In operations room, intelligence deals out the gen for the day's strike. Interest is in the Daegu Bulge, where North Koreans are making an all-out effort to capture the city and vital airstrip. They will strike at the enemy within 5 miles of the strip. The boys move out to their aircraft. This is Japan's midsummer. Temperatures are high and humidity extreme. These Australian pilots have earned the complete respect of the Americans because of their achievements in action. They have played an important part in helping to stiffen morale of ground forces, which had been gravely affected by overwhelming numbers in opposition and early lack of tanks and other weapons. It is important to recall that the war broke out in Korea on June the 25th, and the men of the Australian Squadron went into action alongside the Americans 8 days later, the first United Nations unit to do so. Spence gives the signal and the planes move out. Aircraftsmen fit a Cinesound camera on remote control and a Mustang belly tank. It will bring you some mighty thrilling pictures in a few minutes. Iwakuni control shows the green light and the squadron's away. This time you go with them, seeing what they see through the camera's eye.
'77 Squadron was the only formed unit of Mustangs in the Far East Command. The P-51 Mustangs were predecessors to the F-80 Shooting Stars used by the US pilots. The Mustangs, however, were more suitable for the rough Korean airfields. They were cheaper to maintain and had a longer range of operation than the F-80s.
First strike. Whiteman rode in a whirlaway, batting along at a rugged 180 miles per hour with the Mustangs throttled back so that he could hold them. The coast of Korea is ahead. The rugged terrain below will give a new appreciation of the enormity of the task of the raw, young American troops who first came to grips with the North Koreans in this type of country. The city of Daegu. It's a sizable town, largely evacuated because it's under northern shell fire. Tens of thousands of refugees from the north camp temporarily in that riverbed before continuing their weary, hopeless trek south. Air Force estimate of this mass living in tents is 40,000.
'77 Squadron were experienced and skilled pilots in air-to-ground gunnery, rocketry and dive bombing. The skills of the squadron, combined with the suitability of the Mustangs, proved to be most effectual in the opening months of the war.
bombing has proved expensive and not very effective against the enemy's guerrilla tactics. But this strafing method throws him into confusion, weakens his troops' morale. The country is alive with North Koreans. If they're not well under cover, they haven't much of a future. Out of ammunition, the squadron turns for Daegu airstrip. It's only a matter of feathering motors and gliding in.
The squadron was down long enough to refuel and reload. 77 Squadron shared the Iwakuni airfield with other pilots who were part of the FEAF, the Far East Air Forces, under the command of Lieutenant General George Stratemeyer.
Off they go for another bash, as the Aussie pilots put it. The Mustangs are having it all their own way at present with practically no air opposition, but they often cop plenty from down below. Tanks are hidden in buildings, camouflaged as haystacks in daylight. Anything suspicious gets it. No tribute can be too high to the skill and daring of these Australian pilots. It's terrible flying country and very uncomfortable if a forced landing becomes necessary, but they never let up day after day, going to the office, doing a dangerous job as readily and as easily as if they were out selling vacuum cleaners in suburban streets. This valley's had it for today, and the enemy down there can't be as happy as he was. Probably a proportion of his numbers couldn't care less about anything, and won't anymore. That's the way it is in war. The strike has been highly successful, and Spence calls his squadron together and heads for home in Japan. Back at Iwakuni base, sirens wail as personnel practice air raid precautions, using the returning Mustangs as hostile aircraft. Should the enemy acquire bombers from somewhere or other, this air base would be #1 objective. Any day, Iwakuni could be attacked. The fire tender stands by in case anyone comes to grief in landing. But there are no accidents and the squadron's down. Home in time for dinner, in fact. None of them were detained at the office.
On the 22nd of August 1950, General Stratemeyer flew to Iwakuni to meet Wing Commander Spence and to award him the Legion of Merit Medal. On the 9th of September, Spence led an attack on a roadblock near Angani, from which he did not return.
This is a major strike, beginning with an attack on a roadblock near that bridge. And our camera brings you the whole gripping record. There's an ack position in the center of that town, and plenty of stuff is being thrown up at us. Machine guns chatter a song of death, and rockets hiss down with terrifying accuracy onto the Reds below. It is with deep regret that we chronicle the fact that it was in this actual action the 77 Squadron's brilliant leader, Wing Commander Lou Spence, was shot down and killed. The Aussie pilots dive low, almost to the floor of the valley, taking incredible risks, for there's plenty of ground fire these days. It was that which took Spence to his death.
This burning village is the contribution made by the Chinese Reds to the Korean scene. With the North Korean aggressors almost totally knocked out, the U.S. Marines advancing toward the Manchurian border are now encountering elements of the Chinese Red Army. Practically the entire North Korean army is in camps like this. The natural accompaniments of war. Poverty, dirt, disease, and the lice that feed on it present a sanitary problem to the UN camp supervisors. DDT is not a Russian invention.
The rugged hills appeared to go on forever, and the United Nations forces lacked accurate maps. This made communication and correct identification of target sites difficult for both air and ground forces. The Allies' light aircraft carried airborne controllers to provide information about targets, to aid the ground troops, and to inform the bombers of where their next operations would be.
New deadly weapon, belly tanks loaded with napalm, also known as gelitol. It's a highly inflammable jelly which is fused and dropped to spray flaming death on enemy foxholes and guerrilla positions.
Napalm bombing proved to be effective against the North Koreans. Interrogation of prisoners revealed that their morale was seriously affected by fear of air attack and napalm bombing. In early November, 77 Squadron flew missions in support of the Royal Australian Regiment 3rd Battalion, who were attempting to drive the Chinese from hilltops overlooking the Taryong River Valley. Mustangs softened the Chinese position with rockets, napalm and machine gun fire, and then strafed the enemy as they fled from their shelters and pits. The distance involved in flying operations from Japan restricted the amount of time 77 Squadron could spend over their target area. 77 Squadron was then moved with the US 35th Wing to Ham Hung to join the 1st Marine Air Wing. The Australians and their Mustangs proved very successful in the early months of the war. The Mustangs only needed a short runway and could carry large quantities of bombs and ammunition. With the onslaught of the Chinese army, the front line changed on a daily basis, and after the squadron had moved to Ham Hung, they soon found themselves in retreat. The Australian pilots at Ham Hung Air Base began carrying weapons everywhere they went on base, using the opportunity to hone their marksmanship skills. The squadron flew rocket missions day and night during the retreat. They particularly sought to aid Marines trapped as the Chinese attempted to surround them. Forced to defend the airfield at Ham Hung, the squadron stood their ground when many chose to withdraw. Following the withdrawal from Ham Hung, 77 Squadron moved to a new base which had the serial number K9 and was affectionately known as the Dog Patch. This was changed later to Unityville. Australian Kenneth Black Murray was one of the pilots to enter the war early and flew the greatest number of missions, 333 in all. His story provides a personal, humorous account of the war.
We lived 4 to 5 in a tent with a wooden floor, and central heating was provided by a pot-bellied stove. Now, this stove must have been reasonably effective because the only time I remember the bone-chilling cold was sitting for an hour or so in an unheated aircraft when I was on standby for action. The pot-bellied stove was operational day and night, and when someone absent-mindedly left a can of baked beans on top of it, it exploded with a loud roar, and everybody in the tent just dived for cover under their blankets because they didn't want to get hit with these hot baked beans. But nevertheless, they flew everywhere. They completely impregnated the inside of the tent, which had to be replaced. The airfield itself was constructed of sheets of metal and generally served its purpose very well. The only time it did not was when a Navy pilot touched down and pulled up the metal sheets of the runway behind him like the lid of a sardine can.
77 Squadron had been flying close support missions from the second week of the war with notable bravery and distinction. They had a high standard of training and an ability to adapt quickly. But when the first Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters were seen in the skies in November, the Australians knew that the usefulness of the Mustangs had been severely restricted. The MiG-15s were the latest in aircraft technology, with a light airframe and jet engines that had outstanding handling and climbing power. The US F-86 Sabres were the only aircraft that could match the MiG-15s. They shared the swept-wing design and could achieve similar speeds. It became apparent that if 77 Squadron were to continue their outstanding contribution, they would have to have higher performance aircraft. The problem was that production of the Sabres was at full capacity, just supplying the Americans. This appeared to be solved when the British agreed to provide 77 Squadron with a squadron of Gloucester Meteor 8 interceptors. But although they were jets, they were no match for the MiGs, nor did they equal the performance of the Sabres. The Australian pilots thus decided to concentrate on escorting bombers and flying combat air patrols to protect fighter bombers. In late 1951, the RAAF developed a new type of rocket containing napalm known as the Flying Onion. The big tanks containing napalm, previously used by 77 Squadron, bounced and skidded across the ground. They were difficult to deliver accurately without getting hit by ground fire. Wing Commander Susans and his squadron flew trial missions. Flight Lieutenant J.C. Smith, Wing Armament Officer of No. 91 Composite Wing RAAF Iwakuni, played a leading part in the rocket's design and in supervising manufacture. He was awarded the MBE for these and other services. The severe cold of the Korean winter hampered operations. Further problems were caused by the amount of clothing the pilots had to wear. The heating system in the Meteor's cockpit was inadequate. The RAAF ground crews did an outstanding job under difficult conditions, readying aircraft for operations. As there were no hangars, the aircraft were parked on the flight lanes at the mercy of the elements and often had to be swept clean of snow before any work at all could begin. Every 6 weeks, the 77 Squadron pilots flew to Iwakuni for servicing and to bring back new aircraft. The 2-day break gave them a chance to catch up with friends. Cricket is a game that can be played any time, and here we see pilots relaxing with a couple of overs. A chance to exercise and enjoy some light relief from the tensions of war was hard to ignore. Units of RAAF active in the Korean War included No. 91 Composite Wing, No. 77 Squadron, No. 30 Communications Unit, No. 30 Transport Unit, No. 36 Transport Squadron, No. 391 Base Squadron, and No. 491 Maintenance Squadron. These units, although not great in number, made a huge contribution in combating the Chinese and North Korean attacks against the South Koreans. The Korean War showed, more than any other war, Australia's air, land and navy forces working closely together to achieve the desired result against an advancing enemy. Experience gained by 77 Squadron with Meteors in Korea helped to advance the RAAF into the jet age. The excellent base support helped 77 Squadron achieve its high performance level. At these bases, the level of technical support was outstanding. Some crews, made up of Australian and Japanese technicians, worked up to 16 hours a day. This devotion to duty enabled 77 Squadron to be far more effective because its planes were kept fully operational. 77 Squadron flew 18,872 sorties. It lost 37 pilots, had 7 men captured, and went home to Australia after 10 years. The squadron had been away since 1943. It had earned a high reputation among Australia's allies and with their peers back home. Neville Govett was one of the first Australian soldiers to enter Korea after fighting had begun. Neville swapped cigarettes to buy film to record these images.
Shine on moon, o'er a mountain high, out where the
3 RAR were stationed at Hiro, Japan as part of BCOF, and they were getting ready to leave for Australia in June 1950. Instead of going home to loved ones, they found themselves helping to defend Japan against possible air attacks.
With the eyes of the world focused on the southeastern corner of Korea and the desperate battles being fought there, came the astounding news of the United Nations counteroffensive at Incheon, where out of the mists of the Yellow Sea, Task Force 77 appeared to hurl a preliminary bombardment at the city, the harbor of Seoul, capital of South Korea. Sweeping strategy, the concept of which is to get behind the Red invaders, cut their supply lines, and then crush them in a giant nutcracker. Led by Marine veterans of the Southern fighting, the armada of 262 ships disgorged men and equipment.
Aussies leave their barracks at Hero, Japan on the way to the battlefront in Korea. This is the job they volunteered for, and they're angry and disappointed they've not been sent into action earlier. Now, with North Korean defenses crumbling, they feel they're too late, but they might still see plenty of action. Through rain-soaked streets, they're driven to Kure, the United Nations main naval base in Japan, to embark in the United States troop transport Aiken Victory. In misty rain and the fading light of a late Japanese afternoon, the diggers begin the last stage of their journey. Tough, well-disciplined troops, anxious to have a go. They were our enemies 5 years ago, and now they're helping us fight someone else. Commander of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force, Lieutenant General Robertson, goes aboard to wish the diggers good luck. Japanese girls beneath traditional umbrellas watch the embarkation of troops going to fight a war almost on Japan's doorstep. Dawn next day, the coast of Nippon far behind, the troops relax on deck. Bluey Jones and his bandy wallop bombardiers. No wonder the boys want to get into action. Who knows, a sniper might puncture that squeeze box. But maybe it's a secret weapon designed to strike terror into the North Koreans. Those who don't love classical music play cards, and those who don't play cards play chuck-a-luck. It's a sort of crown and anchor, and the boys bet like big graziers trying to get rid of a wool check. Of course, the national game is not neglected. 50 and he heads them. Up they go, down they come. Good on ya, Baldy. A British destroyer guards Aiken Victory from attack as the coast of Korea comes into sight. This is the port where the Aussies will disembark, a vital United Nations base flanked by high, rugged mountains. South Koreans show their appreciation of the diggers' arrival, singing their own version of Waltzing Matilda, accompanied by a Korean Marine band. But if you don't mind, we'll spare you that. Everyone, including the girls, have tiny flags made hurriedly when they knew the Australians were coming. First men ashore are presented with bouquets by the Women's Welcoming Committee. Now, if they'd only made it a dozen beer apiece. The Australians' commanding officer, youthful Lieutenant Colonel Green, gets his posy too. There's none for Major Ferguson, but he's the adjutant. They never get bouquets.
Australian soldier Joe Vesgoff commented,
"We arrived at Pusan on the Aiken Victory and were met at the wharf by an American band. One of the numbers they played was, 'If I'd known you were coming, I'd have baked a cake.' I think they should have played Home on the Range, as we were herded onto huge cattle trucks."
Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Green, the men of 3 RAR were then sent by train to Taegu, where they began their patrol work over ground that had been recaptured by US Marines who'd landed at Incheon 13 days before. The Australians first saw action on the 2nd of October and suffered their first casualties the next day. At the Battle of the Broken Bridge, 8 Australians were killed and 22 wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Green was fatally wounded by a shell fragment near Cheongju. He and the others who had died were later exhumed from Pakchon and buried in the United Nations Cemetery at Busan. In 1951, the Australians took part in 2 major battles. The first was on the evening of the 23rd of April, when the Chinese forced the withdrawal of 6 ROK Division down the Kapyong Valley. To block the breach in the line, the Australian and Canadian battalions were positioned across the line of the advancing Chinese. The Australians, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel I.B. Ferguson, occupied position on Hill 504. They came under heavy enemy attack on the morning of the 24th. The Chinese seemed to have enormous numerical superiority, and their attacks increased in frequency until they became one continuous onrush of troops. The night's action had cost A Company 3 RAR 50 casualties. During the morning of the 24th, 4 Platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Montgomery, launched a bayonet charge to retake a position from the Chinese. During the remainder of the day, D Company, on the summit of Hill 504, came under increasing enemy attack. Commencing at 7 a.m. on the 25th, the Chinese continued to attack the company until early afternoon. Realizing that it would not survive another night in the position, the battalion completed a difficult withdrawal along the ridge line through the D Company position. D Company held their position to facilitate withdrawal, despite being mistakenly attacked by 2 Corsair aircraft, which dropped napalm, killing 2 Australians and wounding several more. Under the command of Major O'Dowd, the 4 rifle companies conducted a perfect withdrawal to a defensive position some miles to the south. The defense of Kapyong had cost the battalion 32 killed, 59 wounded, and 3 prisoners of war. One of the wounded soldiers, Harold Giddens, offered encouragement to others despite his own horrific injuries, as Nugget Dunk, Private Ronald Edward, explains.
I was reaching into a trench to grab a chap who had all his grenades lined up, which is customary, as you know, on the forepart of the trench. When the grenades went off, this blew me down the hill quite a considerable part. But luck being what it is, I get very few injuries out of it, just a few shrapnel wounds in the leg. I saw the most appalling apparition. A man with no flesh. And his hands dripping flesh. Completely naked. And as he walked, these huge, bloated feet, all burnt. The stones, and the sticks came up through his feet. And he sat down next to me and he said, of course I didn't know what it was, who it was. And he said, he looked at me and he said, Jesus, Nugget, he said, you're having a rough day.
The 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment was awarded a US presidential citation by President Truman for their performance in the Battle of Kapyong. During the period between the battles of Kapyong and Mariang San, 3 RAR were transferred to the 28th Commonwealth British Brigade and sent to gain control of the north bank of the Im Jin River.
Flags of Australia and the United Nations fly side by side over headquarters of the Australian Battalion in Korea. The Aussies, many from Japan, where they served under General Sir Horace Robertson, have a fine record. Now their battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson, gets orders to move back into the front line. The diggers promise a hot reception for the enemy. Though right now the enemy is strictly on the defensive. The communists are not far away, though, and the Aussies begin a patrol in force across the Im Jin River. They advance warily across an open paddy field. This is no man's land. Under temporary cover until resistance is mopped up, they move forward again. The boys call this hill hopping, advancing from hill to hill in a rugged and unfriendly country. With Russian peace overtures, it may not be long before the diggers and their United Nations allies have won the victory they seek. But just in case the communists do come back for more, wiring parties put up a formidable barrier. It's not just a barbed wire fence either. These boys are setting a trip flare beyond the perimeter using fine wire stretched across a track. The platoon commander watches positions from which machine guns are firing. They won't be firing long, though. Diggers call up the Air Force. Good shooting. Another hill in Allied hands. Diggers show their mettle in Korea.
In late May, Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson departed for Australia, and in July, Lieutenant Colonel F.G. Hassett took command of the battalion. A large proportion of 3 RAR had completed their tour before the Battle of Mariang San. The battalion was reinforced by a strong contingent of volunteers specially raised in Australia to fight in Korea.
K-Force was raised to lift the numbers of the rather run-down Australian Army at that time to build up the strengths in the battalion. And these were soldiers who re-enlisted for 1 year of service in Korea. Many of them, as I've said, had had World War II experience. Some had not. The young regulars were around the 20, 21 years of age, and this mix I found to be a good mix, because there was the enthusiasm of the young who wanted to make their name as soldiers, and the experience of the K-Force experienced soldiers who provided a lead in many of the activities. This system of individual relief was a very bad one, and it only happened with the 3rd Battalion during its stay in Korea, and it hadn't happened before, and I'm glad to say it hasn't happened since. What it meant was that as a year passed, a year of service in Korea, those individual soldiers were withdrawn, and fresh soldiers, reinforcements, took their place. This changeover of personnel was not just individuals daily, but by dozens daily. And at times I felt as though I was commanding a transit depot in action. The constant turbulence meant that there was a lack of cohesion within the sections and the platoons, and also a very heavy loss of experienced NCOs and officers.
In July, the 1st Commonwealth Division was formed, commanded by the British Major General Jim Castles. It consisted of the 25th Canadian Infantry Brigade and the 28th and 29th Commonwealth Infantry Brigades. Later, when Australia had 2 battalions in Korea, the 28th Brigade was commanded by Australian Brigadiers Thomas Daly and John Wilton. 3 RAR, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, and the King's Shropshire Light Infantry made up the 28th Brigade under Brigadier George Taylor. The brigade was supported by the 16th Field Regiment Royal New Zealand Artillery and by Centurion tanks of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars. By the end of September, a UN offensive with the codename Commando was planned. It had 3 major objectives. 1, to clear the enemy from the railway. 2, to capture a number of steep hills to prevent the enemy from viewing Allied troop movements. And 3, to inflict maximum losses on the enemy. The Commonwealth Division was to concentrate on the 2nd objective, capturing the hills. Major General Castles planned to capture the Jamestown line in 3 phases. First, on the 3rd of October, the 28th Brigade would take Hill 355 in the East Central sector. Second, on the 4th of October, the 25th Brigade would take Hill 187 and the Southwestern Ridge. Third, on the 5th of October, the 28th Brigade would take Hills 217 and 317.
And the brigadier went through this attack, which was to take place in early October. And in our area, it meant taking out two very dominant features, 355, Little Gibraltar, and one deeper in, 317, Mary Ann Sang. The brigadier went through the battle in a very simple way. I was a little concerned about the role being given to the 3rd Battalion because it was a big role. It meant a long approach march with open flanks and then a penetration of about 3 kilometres through strongly held Chinese positions where the Chinese were well armed, well equipped and determined to stay.
Lieutenant Colonel Hassett had been given the capture of Hill 317 as his primary task. He decided that the best way to attack the hill was to approach along a wooded ridge which ran from the east to the summit. He told his company commander that the battalion would cross the valley under cover of darkness and seize Hill 199, approximately halfway to Hill 317. At dawn, they would establish a firm base, then cross the next valley in darkness and climb to the crest of the eastern ridge of Hill 317 to attack the defending Chinese. At 3 a.m. on the 3rd of October, A and B Company began to make their way across the valley through the river mist and thick vegetation. They took Hill 199, from which they had a clear view of Hill 355.
The taking of 199 was, of course, a preliminary to our attack along the ridgeline further north, but it was also part of the brigade plan to get tanks up onto 199, which they did with difficulty, and machine guns to fire across on the rear slopes of 355, Little Gibraltar, to support the KOSB attack on 355.
The KOSB was struggling to gain the summit of 355. Hassett decided to use his reserve, C Company, commanded by Major Girk, to make an attack on the eastern face. This surprised the Chinese. C Company made a determined charge into the Chinese position. Girk and Lieutenant M.B. Pears, his leading platoon commander, were in the thick of the action. Private J. Burnett ran 25 metres ahead of the platoon, throwing grenades and firing his Bren gun from the hip. Despite heavy return fire, he won through and was followed quickly by the remainder of the section.
Brigadier Taylor got onto me by line and told me that the KOSB had not succeeded in getting 355, that they had halted short of the objective and were digging in on the lower slopes of the 355 collection of features. He said the trouble was coming from two features, three knolls, known as 220, both known as 220, which were firing and catching the KOSB in enfilade. And he asked me, or ordered me, to take out these two features the following morning. I ordered Girk to do this task. We were able to look at the 220 features and discuss the task generally. And at first light the following morning, he took off with his company. He crossed the valley in darkness and in the mist, the river mist when it came up. He surprised the Chinese on the first 220 feature, and in a very brutal infantry battle, the leading platoon, which was Pear's platoon, took out that feature. They then, Girk then ordered an advance on the second of the 220 features, which went off in good style, and it was cleared in a similar fashion to the first feature. Gurk, with some of his soldiers, then cleared up to the top of 355, where they had a good look round the battlefield, and I'm sure had a feeling of deep satisfaction that they'd captured the KOSB objective, which they had.
C Company cleared out the Chinese, who panicked, leaving behind large quantities of new winter clothing, weapons, propaganda leaflets, ammunition and other equipment. The 25th Brigade achieved its objective. The Shropshires took Hills 210 and 227. They advanced to take their final objectives on the Jamestown line. With Phase 2 complete, the 28th Brigade faced their final objective, Mariang San. The Chinese had reinforced their defences on this complex of hills on the 5th of October.
Early on the morning of the 5th, I moved my attack headquarters to a position of observation where I could look across the valley where the main action was going to take place on that day. The plan was for B Company to cross the valley and get a toehold on the ridgeline running east from 317, and then to swing west and attack up the ridgeline. It was to be followed by D Company, which was to be the reserve company for the preliminary phases of that movement, but I recognise would probably have to be used at some stage during the attack on 317, because it would be beyond the capacity of one company, B Company in this instance, to advance that considerable distance over that broken ground against strong opposition. C Company was the reserve company, and A Company was doing its diversionary role, attacking up the ridgeline running southeast from 317.
B and D companies with C in reserve began to clear the lower slopes of Hill 317. The task was long and hard for the men of B and D Company, who'd been fighting all day against the strongly positioned Chinese. When D Company began to make good progress, taking the last 3 knolls, Hassett decided to move C Company in support to gain the summit quickly. Gurk raced C Company into attack on a knoll known as Baldy before the Chinese could recover from D Company's success.
And I kept Gurk beside me in these preliminary attacks because I wanted him to be thoroughly in the picture and thoroughly in my mind, so that when I gave him a task, he would understand what was required and we'd get the attack underway quickly.
Once the Australians had gained their objective, they had to withstand a hail of enemy machine gun and mortar fire. During the 6th and 7th of October, the Chinese directed heavier and heavier fire on the Australian positions. On the night of the 7th, the Chinese attacked 3 times. The Australians had used 4 times the normal amount of ammunition. Despite the efforts of the Korean porters who struggled up the steep hills with heavy loads of supplies, ammunition ran short.
It was the heaviest barrage that anyone had experienced. We didn't really know that they had so much artillery. We hadn't really appreciated they knew how to use it either. Although later on we're thinking about it, we believed the Russians taught them, and the Russians were great gunners. Yeah, well, at first light, the mist was still pretty heavy, you know, but at least you could see a bit without illumination. Everyone's peering, and then the mist lifted, and you realise, well, you could see them. They were out picking up their wounded and their dead, I guess. Chinese didn't like to leave bodies on the ground. They didn't like body counts being done. They would try and take them in. They had Red Cross bands on. And they were, from where the side that I was on, would have, I think I could have seen about half a dozen teams working there. And I've no doubt that they were working on the forward platoon there and down out here as well, where the attacks have been coming through. And Wings called out, "Guns, are you going to fire on them?" And I said, I had to look at it and I said, "Oh, no, I think, you know, enough's enough."
A Company managed to render a Chinese company ineffective, collapsing enemy resistance. The British and New Zealand artillery gave crucial support during the battle. On the morning of the 8th of October, it was obvious to the men of the 3rd Battalion that they had won the battle. In 5 days of fighting, 3 RAR had defeated a numerically superior enemy. They had shown great courage and determination, working together day and night under Hassett's direction to achieve one of the greatest feats of the Australian Army during the Korean War. The Korean War also saw helicopters used for the first time to carry out the wounded. They lifted the wounded to mobile army surgical hospitals known as MASH units.
The first helicopter I saw in Korea was a rather tragic episode. The CSM of B Company was wounded and shot in the neck, and he was carried out to the battalion casualty collecting point, and that was the first time I saw a helicopter used, and that was a Sioux helicopter with 2 panniers on the side to put the casualties in, as you've seen on MASH. They had a great disadvantage in that there was, once he went in there, he was in there till you landed. There was no one to look after him as there is now. You know, you've got an orderly in a dust-off chopper now who can look after the fellow. And the CSM was bandaged in the neck, around the neck, to stop the bleeding. And he was loaded into this bay, and the pilot afterwards said he saw him. He was dead when they got him back to the Normash, and the pilot said that he had seen that he was, you know, he'd come conscious and was pulling at the bandage, which was probably caused him to bleed to death. So it was rather a tragic one, but that was the first episode I saw that was the first time that I'm aware of that we had any support from helicopter evacuation. But it was certainly the way to go despite that unfortunate incident.
Speed was critical. The choppers could be called quickly and they could be warned to stay clear of artillery fire. Without the helicopters, the death toll would have been much greater. The evacuation of casualties by field ambulance was complicated by steep hills that were devoid of cover. The roads were either icy, muddy, or thick with dust. There was usually at least 20 to 30 kilometers between the front line and the MASH units, but the field ambulances worked non-stop, getting the wounded to safety. 3 RAR suffered heavy casualties on 3 occasions. The first were lost in the days of battle immediately after their arrival. The second heavy casualty count was at Kapyong. The third and most severe was at Mariangsan. On their return to Australia, the soldiers met wide public acclaim for their actions in Korea. These men are wearing on their sleeves the emblem of the US Presidential Citation awarded to the battalion after the Battle of Kapyong. Prime Minister Menzies praised the battalion warmly.
Australia was never in doubt that its soldiers in Korea would acquit themselves with honour. But members of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, have done much more than their simple duty.
In response to pressure from President Truman for more ground troops in Korea, the Australian government decided to increase its commitment by an additional battalion. Army headquarters in Melbourne had decided that it was better to replace whole units after 12-month service. The new unit rotation system replaced whole battalions instead of individuals in a unit. The unit rotation system proved to be effective, and the new battalions needed less time to become fully battle-worthy after arriving in Korea. In October 1951, it was announced that 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment would be sent to Korea. They spent 3 months training in Australia.
The 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 1,400 tough, trained soldiers bound for Korea to join the Australian troops who've been fighting there since the very early stages of the war, march through Sydney streets prior to embarkation. The men are led by mascot Septimus. Sep, you're out of step, probably because he can't go to Korea too. A big crowd lines the route as the men swing past the saluting base at the town hall, where the Governor-General, Sir William McKell, takes the salute. In the march, and also bound for Korea, is a New Zealand contingent of 145 reinforcements for the New Zealand Field Artillery Unit. To the strains of Soldiers of the Queen, the Anzacs march again. At the wharf, thousands of friends and relatives wait to see the troopship sail. It's a day of laughter and tears. Lightheartedness, some of it a little forced, contrasting with the sorrow of parting. Mothers from their sons, husbands from their wives, and sweethearts unable to look to a normal future because war holds them apart. Their average age is 21. Only one of them knows what parting really means. Yes, the spirit of Anzac still lives, and young Australians and New Zealanders still carry high the burning torch of freedom. Men must fight, and women must wait.
One RAR embarked from Sydney on the 3rd of March in the British troop transport Devonshire and arrived in Korea on the 6th of April. They continued their training for some months before becoming operational. One RAR joined the 28th Brigade in early June 1952. One RAR were involved in many patrol clashes and minefield incidents during their year of fighting. A typical action at this time was Operation Fauna. Brigadier Daly ordered Lieutenant Colonel Austin, commanding officer of 1 RAR, to raid an enemy position and take prisoners. The raid coincided with a Chinese attack on the 1st ROK Division, which created a diversion for the 1 RAR raiding party. 1 RAR swept through the Chinese position, killing all enemy troops encountered, but the Australian casualties mounted to a serious level. As a result, they retreated without capturing a prisoner. Operation Fauna was the last major operation of 1 RAR before the battalion returned home to Australia.
Soon after the ship docks, the troops disembarked to march through Brisbane in the city's biggest welcome since the war. 75,000 cheering people line the streets as men of the 1st Battalion swing past the saluting base at the City Hall. The men of the 1st lost 35 killed and 5 missing in Korea. 5 died of wounds and 166 were wounded. But they won 8 gallantry awards and inflicted hundreds of casualties on the communist enemy.
It was replaced by 2 RAR.
600 marching men give Australians a grim reminder that communist aggression still continues. These troops are the boys of Victoria's own, the 2nd Battalion. And Defence Minister Sir Philip McBride takes the salute as they march past prior to embarkation for Korea. With bayonets glistening in Melbourne sunshine, they're bound for the Korean winter to uphold the traditions of Australians who've been fighting there for more than 2 years. Thousands give them a tumultuous farewell. Men pledged to stop World War III before it starts.
2 RAR was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel G.F. Larkin. The battalion established an aggressive patrolling program along the Jamestown line, along with 3 RAR. For several months, they were involved in small skirmishes, but in July 1953, Brigadier Wilton placed both of the Australian battalions in forward positions to defend a position known as the Hook. On the 23rd of July, Brigadier Wilton called his battalion commanders to a conference. He informed them that signature of the armistice agreement was imminent and that only essential security patrols were to be sent out. Despite the approaching armistice, the Chinese decided to make several strong attacks on the Hook. The Australian battalions endured nights of heavy fire from the Chinese. When they penetrated the Australians' position, bitter hand-to-hand fighting followed. 2 RAR were hardest hit with 17 dead and 31 wounded. The 2nd Battalion held fast to their positions and drove the Chinese back. The armistice was signed on the 27th of July. When 2 RAR climbed out of their defences, they saw the floor of the valley covered with dead Chinese soldiers. Brigadier Wilton estimated that there were between 2,000 and 3,000 dead Chinese in front of the hook. The Korean War showed once again that the Australian soldier was versatile and tough and had outstanding initiative. The Australian contingent in Korea was an all-volunteer force. When recruiters called for men with experience in the Second World War, there was no shortage of applicants. The Australian soldiers fought hard in tough conditions against an enemy of far greater numbers, yet they proved themselves to be brave, determined, and capable of organising themselves on the battlefield more effectively than others. The Australians looked after each other. Mateship was strong, and many would dash aggressively to the offensive, using their quick wit and persistence to protect each other and to achieve their objectives. Kim Il-sung appeared to be confident of a rapid victory by virtue of the North Korean superiority on land and in the air. He seems to have given little thought to the significance of the sea. The United Nations forces had complete command of the sea and were able to transport troops and supplies to South Korea without difficulty. The strategic significance of the seas around Korea was enhanced because Korea is a peninsula. Much of its land area can be covered readily by sea-based air power. Any army advancing down the peninsula or along railways, roads, and bridges on the coast would be open to attack from the sea. When news of the Korean War broke out, the Royal Australian Navy had 2 ships in Japanese waters, HMAS Shoalhaven and Bataan. HMAS Bataan, however, was there to replace HMAS Shoalhaven, which was due to return to Australia for refitting. The Australian government had committed both these ships, so Shoalhaven's return to Australia was deferred. The Shoalhaven escorted convoys between Sasebo and Busan until it was relieved by HMAS Warramunga in late August. The amphibious assault on Incheon was launched on the 15th of September. This operation was a brilliant success and marked a turning point in the war. This type of operation was not attempted again because of a political decision to avoid further escalation of the war. The Commonwealth ships in the Incheon operation provided reconnaissance and cover for the main force while it was moving into the Incheon area. The Bataan and Warramunga would normally have been stationed for a tour of 5 to 6 months. Because relief was not available, it was decided that the ships would stay in Korean waters until late in 1951. Bataan and Warramunga took part in a dangerous operation involving movement at night through 40 miles of narrow, mined waters to evacuate 7,000 wounded troops from Chinampo. HMAS Anzac and Tobruk were the first warships in Commonwealth navies to be equipped with the new British 4.5-inch Mark VI turrets and the flyplane electronic fire-controlled system. These were responsible for major improvements in accuracy and destructive capability. The principal contribution of the United Nations naval forces was to provide constant support to ground forces with naval air power. The Royal Australian Navy took on a new responsibility in Korean waters in 1951 when HMAS Sydney, a light aircraft carrier, arrived. Sea-based air power was important because there were few serviceable airfields in Korea for Allied aircraft. Aircraft based in Japan had to fly hundreds of miles, thus reducing the time they could spend in target areas. Secure lines of communication from the UN support bases to Japan were established with the help of United Nations Command Sea Power. Naval aircraft contributed to the blockade of North Korean ports. Carrying heavy bomb loads, they would attack at low levels and could remain in the target zone for longer than land-based aircraft. The Australian carrier squadrons were of direct assistance to the operations of British and Australian ground forces. During the Korean War, Royal Australian Naval Air Power was of great significance, as it placed Australia among the select group of powers which could demonstrate a capacity to use complex sea power in warfare. Sydney replaced HMS Glory. On its first patrol, its aircraft flew 47 sorties on each of the first 2 days. Precision of the gunfire from HMAS Sydney pilots was praised by its allies. These positive results strengthened the confidence of its crew. Sydney had 3 squadrons, totaling 35 aircraft, pushing the ship's facilities to the limit. The aircraft handlers were on deck an hour before dawn, preparing the planes. They remained on duty until after dark in freezing conditions to maintain aircraft for the ship's 24 Sea Fury and 14 Firefly pilots. The missions were of many types: strikes, armed reconnaissance, close support for ground troops, usually Australian or other Commonwealth units, spotting for naval gunfire, combat air patrols over target areas, providing ships for the blockade, convoys and rescue of downed pilots, anti-submarine patrols, and aerial photography. The weather proved to be a major difficulty. Typhoons were followed by intense cold and snowstorms. The bad weather affected the mechanics of aircraft and meant many hours of extra work for the ship's crew. Sydney inflicted heavy damage on the enemy, more than 3,000 casualties, and the destruction of 66 bridges, 7 tunnels, 38 sections of railway line, 7 rail sidings, 5 water towers, 2 locomotives, 159 railway trucks, 2,060 houses, 495 junks or sampans, and 15 guns. The Royal Australian Navy contingent consisted of 9 RAN ships with a total of 4,500 men serving through the 3 years of war. These contributed to a positive result in Korean waters.
There's a big welcome from wives and sweethearts for the men of HMAS Anzac back in Sydney from Korea. Now, I wonder which one is Lovey. This one, maybe. No, not him. That's not Lovey. No, he was kind of taller and younger. And how about this one? Yeah, that's Lovey. Oh, no, it's not. No. This one, then. Ah, yes, that's definitely Lovey. And boy, is he glad, is she glad, or are they glad he's back home. There's a happy reunion, too, for the sons of Anzac's Captain Mesley and for Mrs. Mesley. But there's a special welcome for the 18 members of the crew who became proud daddies while they were at sea. Who said sailors don't care? They've missed the first few months of their children's lives, but they're going to get a ball-to-ball description.
The Australian flag is hauled to the masthead in Freedom Village outside Panmunjom. Approaching the welcome gate are ambulances bringing in the first Australian prisoners of war released in Korea. There are 5 of them: Privates Brian Daveron and Eric Donnelly of Sydney, John Mackay of Western Australia, John Davis of Queensland, and Glenn Brown of South Australia. There's Donnelly now, a former Sydney newspaper photographer. John Mackay of Western Australia, who was wounded in the leg, arm and chest. J. Davis of Queensland is anxious to get out of Chinese-issued clothing. Most of them said that the communists treated them fairly well, and it is true that they all appear to be in reasonably good condition despite their wounds. It's good to be back with his cobbers, and boy, oh boy, it's great to feel that old digger's hat on his head again.
In April 1953, the Chinese and North Koreans became more flexible on the question of voluntary repatriation. An exchange of sick and wounded prisoners who had cooperated with their captors was arranged. With the expectations of an armistice, conditions in the prison camps improved, but not for those undergoing punishment or still being interrogated by the Chinese, who hoped to elicit confessions that the Americans had used germ warfare. The Australians in these camps did not confess under torture. One Australian, Private Madden, died of starvation and ill treatment. For gallantry as a prisoner of war and his refusal to cooperate, he was posthumously awarded the George Cross. 4 other soldiers and 2 Air Force officers suffered mental and physical cruelty after unsuccessful but heroic attempts to escape. Those in captivity in 1951 were subjected to a so-called re-education program, as a group and later individually, but no Australian gave in to indoctrination. The remaining Australian prisoners of war were exchanged in Operation Big Switch.
Well, I was a prisoner of war for 2.5 years, and I can tell you I'm very, very pleased to be back again in my life, especially my son, who I hardly knew when I got here. And also my buddy here, he was reported killed. All right, Keith?
Yeah, don't feel too dead now, though. It's starting to liven up again.
He's certainly looking pretty good health.
When the armistice had been in force long enough to prove its effectiveness, the first phase of withdrawal began. The steps were the reduction of the 1st Commonwealth Division to a brigade group, the Commonwealth Navy down to 4 warships, and the air component to transport aircraft. Of these, Australia would supply 1 battalion, 1 warship, and 2 transport aircraft. 3 RAR sailed from Busan on the 9th of November, ending more than 4 years in Korea. The remaining 1st Battalion withdrew in March 1956.
The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, gets the Queen's colour and new regimental colours from the Governor-General, Sir William Slim. The colours are consecrated, blessed and dedicated in a new ceremony with the Chaplains General of the Church of England, United Protestant and Catholic Churches. 5 years ago today, the 3rd won the United States Presidential Citation at the Battle of Kapyong in Korea. Now the 3rd gets its new colours, to which proudly the Kapyong streamer will be attached. The Governor-General inspects the battalion, which has earned the name Old Faithful, the result of 9 years' service overseas in Japan and then in the war against aggression in Korea. And how proudly they march. The gallant 3rd, whose officers and men have won 4 Distinguished Service Orders, 17 military crosses, 29 military medals, and numbers of United States awards for gallantry. The Governor-General said, most of your traditions have yet to be made, but few units have equaled your bravery at Kapyong. The Fighting 3rd, who 5 years ago on the eve of Anzac Day, carried on the tradition of Gallipoli.
77 Squadron remained in Korea until October 1954 and sailed on British aircraft carrier HMS Vengeance, back home for the first time since February 1943. The Australians had stood and fought alongside more allies in Korea than in any war before or since. The quality of service of Australian soldiers, airmen and sailors, and the speed with which they were offered cemented and strengthened Australia's reputation as a valuable ally. The Korean War ended on the 27th of July, 1953. The numbers of casualties of this 3-year war are almost beyond belief. 74,000 South Korean and United Nations troops died, 250,000 were wounded, and 84,000 were captured or missing in action. Casualties among the North Korean and Chinese forces have been estimated at well over 1 million. 339 Australian personnel were killed. There were 1,216 wounded and 29 prisoners of war. The Korean War was unpopular. The Australian public never really understood why it was being fought at all. It became known as the Forgotten War, a war no one wanted to remember except those who had fought and their families. The United Nations had overcome enormous odds to regain South Korea as the Republic of Korea. In this, they were successful. The North Koreans had failed in their attempt to conquer the South, and the Chinese had suffered overwhelming losses in coming to the North Koreans' aid. The Australians showed, as in other wars, that whether in the air, on land or sea, they remain an efficient and excellent ally. There is a permanent memorial for Australians who played a part in the Korean War on Anzac Parade in front of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra.